So you may know that this is the 5-year Via Fidelis initiative that our Bishop, Father June, has launched last year with an emphasis on evangelization. This month, year 2 will emphasize catechesis. And we are so blessed and so delighted to have Dr. Michael Martocchio speak, because he is the director of catechesis and Christian formation for the Diocese of Charleston. He got his undergraduate bachelor's degree from from Franciscan University in Steubenville, and with an emphasis or the degree in theology there. And then he went on and got his PhD, his MA and PhD from Duquesne University, also in theology. He is a great resource, a gracious and humble soul, and we're delighted to have him to talk about catechesis in year 2 of Via Fidelis. Thank you.
Well, thank you. It's a delight to be with you all. Thank you guys for having me. And we all said what parish we go to. I go to Blessed Sacrament. So and I work. Was that 200 feet away? We're doing the foot measurement. Yeah. Okay. So I wanted to actually start, and I actually I don't like to talk about myself a lot, but I think I always tell people to give their witness, so I probably should do it once in a while. And part of it I think is I don't. What I have to say about myself, I think really, and why I do what I do, I think does blend in with what we're being asked to do, especially this coming year as part of the Via Fidelis process. So it's not off topic. But I always think one of the reasons I don't like talking about myself is because I don't think I have a very interesting conversion story. But the truth of the matter is, God's interested in my story, just as He's interested in all of our stories, because it's really His story, right? And I think sometimes we often do that. We sell ourselves short, and in some ways that's an insult to God, because God's working through all of our lives, and so it's all His story, and so we should recognize that. But I guess the way to maybe start that is by talking a little bit, because it has to be catechetical, right? Because that's what I do. A little bit about the transcendentals. In which we often talk about the transcendentals: truth, beauty, goodness. Also, one of them is unity too. We often forget that one, but that is another one of the transcendentals. And what are they? They're divine attributes. They're actually attributes of God that are reflected in creation. So anytime we see we see something very beautiful. It's a way of relating to God, because it's a reflection of the divine in creation. And the truth is, when we're thinking about our own stories and our witness and what God's done in our lives, it's often through those transcendentals, somewhere through one of those means, that God has worked on us. Oftentimes through multiple of those means. And they appeal to us each differently, and in different degrees, even within an individual's lives. At certain times, maybe you're disposed to thinking about goodness, or thinking about truth or beauty, or even unity. So just kind of keep that in your mind, and I'll come back to that idea. But I grew up in an active Catholic household. We were always involved in our local parish. We went to Mass, but it wasn't just going to Mass. We were involved in other ways. We were involved, there was a very active family ministry when I was very young. And then as I became older, serving in various ministries, especially for me, music ministry, was a big factor in my life, and kind of kept me in the Catholic circle. And so serving in our parish is actually a very important thing, because it does keep us in that Catholic orbit. And our friends and family and community, like our basic community, was Catholics, people we knew from church. But there's a point and there's probably multiple points in our lives that we kind of simplify it, where we begin to consciously take, even when we've grown up in the faith, we begin to consciously take on the faith for ourselves. It becomes our own. And it can kind of happen all of a sudden. It can also be very gradual, organic. Often there's like a mixture of both. God sends us people and moments that move us at particular times in our life. For me, I can think of some of those moments. One of the big ones was attending a youth conference. Frank mentioned I went to Franciscan University of Steubenville. Of course, before that, one of the things that school does as an outreach is these huge youth conferences where you go in and there's thousands of kids, and they still do them all over the country, that are just on fire with the love of the Lord. And so that witness I can think of as one of those turning points in my life. And for the longest time, I tell my story as like that was a turning point in my life. But as I've grown older and kind of really reflected on it, it's the fact, it's not just that it was that moment and it sort of magically happened out of the blue. A lot of it had to do with the fact that I was set up for that. I was set up to have that moment of encounter with Christ, because we were in that Catholic milieu. We were running in those circles. So if you're a parent with kids, I think it is important to have Catholic friends. It is important to be active in your parish community, because that it does set up your kids for you can never guarantee what's going to happen. I think that's the anxiety we all have as parents, right? You never know where your kid's going to be, but they have free will, right? But if we set them up as best as possible, I think that at least gives them a leg up. And I think as I've grown older, kind of realizing that my parents, who were devout Catholics, weren't necessarily like I don't remember ever, sitting down and saying, "All right, Dad, explain to me the Trinity." I even if I did that, I don't know if I would have gotten a very coherent answer. But I would have gotten some kind of response of deep faith, And so, as I've grown older, I've appreciated more the fact that my parents really did set me up for faith. Some of the factors because what happened was, I think that being set up in that milieu of faith made me more receptive to those moments. Those like I said, there's those punctuation moments where God bursts into your life. But I think we're set up for that. With our hearts are made receptive, and part of the receptivity for me. And this kind of brings me back to that idea of where I started with the transcendentals. Was kind of at that time in my life as a teenager, and I think this is really a normal teenage thing, but it really does still actually drive my approach to the faith. I was looking for truth. I was looking for a sense of self, right? Because that's what teenagers are doing, trying to figure out where do I fit in. But I was also looking larger than that. I was trying to figure out what made the most sense of the world we live in. And I kind of sought it out in different places. Went through a real kick of political ideology, but that didn't seem to have the fullness of the picture, and I realized that I kind of had it all along with the Catholic faith, and so that openness made me inquire deeper into my faith, want to grow in my knowledge, my understanding of the truth, and just seeing how the Christian worldview really does make the most sense of of the world we live in. Just think about it. Think about we believe that the world is created good, fundamentally good, but yet is fallen and in need of redemption, right? And holding those two things in tension, right? I think can help us really realize that we have we have a purpose and we have work to do in the world, and it can also help us not get discouraged. We live in a fallen world when things don't always work out well, right? And I think the fact that the Christian worldview is actually it's simple but not simplistic, right? It's a view of the world that, as I said, really does seem to match what we see out there. So as I kind of mused on all of this, I also grew in my desire to serve the mission of the church in deeper ways. So, as Frank mentioned, I studied when it came time to go to college. I decided to study theology with a concentration in catechetics, and eventually that quest for truth kept driving me, and I ended up pursuing a doctorate in theology as Frank mentioned. And the thing about that, and this is even the advice I give people when they're considering graduate studies in theology. I say, there's not a lot of jobs out there. People aren't necessarily like knocking down the door looking for PhDs in theology, and you have to have a passion and love and drive for the truth, for it to be worthwhile. And so that really, my academic pursuit was really more nourishing my spirituality. And the truth is that learning never ends, right? Anyone who's ever actually done graduate studies in really anything, not just theology, knows that the one thing that happens when you work on your master's and then you work on a doctorate or some kind of terminal degree is that you realize how little you know. Like the higher you go in academic study, the stupider you feel. And that's good, actually. that's actually a realization of the vastness of knowledge that's out there and available. And then you couple that with the fact when you're talking about like theology, your object of inquiry is the infinite God, right? So there's always more to grow. There's always more to know. But besides that, besides just having that drive and that hunger to constantly know more, which again, it still is an intrinsic part of my own personal spirituality. I also wanted to remain rooted and kind of grounded in active ministry, mainly to kind of avoid that ivory tower disconnect that's kind of like the academic stereotype, right? But also because it's nice to also have a job somewhere too, all right? Because again, as I mentioned, not everyone's looking for PhDs in theology, and that's really kind of how I came to be here doing this. And if you had told teenage me that this is what I would be doing in a few decades, I would not have believed you. But I think that's how God works in our lives. He works with us. He works with our cooperation, but He also does it in ways that go way beyond our understanding, right? And we look back, and that's why it's often good to kind of do that, to take some time just to reflect back on how God has worked in my life, because sometimes it's clearer when we're looking back than it is, when we're in the moment, right? But realizing that He's there all along, right? And so, like I said, I don't think that's an incredibly interesting story, but I also think it's important to realize that God works in the everyday. God works in our everyday life. So, what does any of that have to do with Via Fidelis? I think it has a lot to do with it. But what is it, first of all? What is Via Fidelis? You've heard it, right? This is not like new.
I saw it in the miscellany.
It was in the miscellany. Huh. How about that? Yeah. And it's been in the miscellany for a long time. Yeah. What is it though?
The way of the faithful?
So it literally means the way of the faithful, or it could also mean the faithful way. And of course both are actually applicable. Why are we doing it? What is it? Besides what it means, what actually is it?
Part of the new evangelization.
It is part of the new evangelization. Yeah, I think so. Someone said something over.
Role model.
Yeah. There's kind of a you said role model. Yeah. There's a path, right? And that's really what it means. Via means way, right? We just mentioned that. It's a path. It's a journey that we're walking on together as a diocesan family. So this is the bishop's vision for our diocese, at least for the next 5 years, right? And he wrote a pastoral letter, incidentally called Via Fidelis, and this is kind of how he describes it. The Via Fidelis, the faithful way, is the way of Jesus. As he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except for me. Each of us has been baptized in the mystery of Christ Jesus. Who have been baptized in the mystery of Christ Jesus have been chosen and are invited to walk the faithful way with the Lord. He invites us, it was not you who chose me, but I chose you and appointed you to go and bear fruit that will remain, so that whatever you ask the Father in my name, he may give you. Knowing our weaknesses and frailty, we confidently turn and rely on Jesus Christ the way. So ultimately, the way is we're being asked to. I'm going to say we have these 5 different themes that we're doing annually, but what we're really doing is none other than just following Christ, right? We're following Him as the way. So none of this stuff should be new to us as Christians. And I think that's the thing sometimes, even when we do this like a diocesan theme, wide theme, but even like national themes or international themes, sometimes we're thinking, well, what's the new thing about this? Well, it's not. I mean, we might be doing it in a new way, but the gospel is perennial. The gospel is true across generations and throughout time. So, what are these phases? I mentioned it's a 5-year plan. We're going to start. We already started this past year proclaiming the faith, and I'll talk a little bit about where we've been and where we're going in a second. But this is the roadmap. Proclaim the faith, an emphasis on evangelization and kerygma. I'll talk about that word in a second. Understand the faith. That's what I'm going to say, kind of set us up for catechesis, and I think that's where I think my my story is adjacent to what we're doing, because that's the thing that still drives me is understanding, right? There's a famous one of our great theologians in the history of the church, St. Anselm of Canterbury. Famously talked about fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding, and it's always resonated with me as kind of how I've always thought about my own spirituality. Celebrate the faith. That's going to come up the following year. So an emphasis on sacraments, particularly, and then an emphasis on service, serve the faith. And then we're kind of come full circle and share the faith in mission, right? And so that we're going to take all we've learned, and again, think of what I said about the transcendentals as these multiple entry points into the faith, and you can kind of see them dispersed throughout these different different years, right? understanding the faith truth, right? Celebrate the faith beauty, serve the faith goodness, right? And so we take those multiple entry points and we go back out on mission, right? That's the vision. So where does this come from besides from the bishop? It actually comes from the catechumenal process, which we now decided we will confuse everyone and call it OCIA instead of RCIA. There's technical reasons for that, because there's actually multiple rites in the Order of Christian Initiation of Adults. So that was what the R was for. It was rite, but it's really a series of rites. So and the other reason was the Latin typical edition says ordo, so we translated it literally. And that's, I'm sorry, that's small, but has anyone been through, before I talk about what it is, did anyone come into the church through the catechumenal process? So several of you have experienced this, either as having been baptized in another tradition and kind of doing the steps of coming in as candidate for full communion, or as not being baptized and doing these steps. It begins with the first proclamation of gospel. We call it the pre-catechumenate. That's sort of, and I kind of liken this process to man-woman relationships, right? It's sort of like, you sort of begin by casually dating, right? And then it becomes more serious and becomes a more committed thing as you go along. That's actually what happens in the catechumenal process. It's very much all right, well, here's the basic good news. Here's the basic proclamation of the faith. No commitments yet, right? Just sometimes what we call this period also inquiry. You'll sometimes hear that, inquirers, right? No commitments. Just hear us out. This is the gospel. This is the good news. This is the message. It's very simple, very basic. And then as that individual starts to feel those pangs of conversion, we become more formalized. We enter into a more formal relationship. It's like now we're a thing. Now we're a couple, right? We're exclusively dating, right? I'm sorry for the imperfectness of that image, but I think it's true, right? We're God loves us, and it's a love story with God, right? So we go the rite of entrance rite of entrance into the catechumenate, and then there's the catechumenate, right? This is a period from the last multiple years of just growing deeper in that knowledge of the faith, right? And you're kind of seeing this. Remember, we were talking about the gospel message, proclaiming the faith, and now we're talking about catechesis. Let's just dig deeper into the faith, and then as that becomes it becomes clear that this person is going to be joining the church, we get even more formal, the rite of election, which is followed by a period of purification and enlightenment, and that's a more intense period of preparing the heart for the sacraments of initiation. And of course, then there's celebration, right? Celebrate the faith is going to be the next step. The sacraments of initiation. Right, and then we don't leave people there. By the way, we continue to form. We continue to grow deeper in the experience of faith. We unpack the mysteries, so to speak. And that's the word we use there is mystagogy, right? And so what we see is a kind of this growing process that brings deeper and deeper conversion, and even that point of we celebrate the sacraments, the work, then we continue to work and grow deeper, right? Conversion keeps going. It's not like, oh, I did that once, right? God's always, the Greek word is metanoia. God's always calling us to the newness. Well, God's always calling us to renew our faith, right? So conversion is for all of us, right? Not just for people who've just recently come into the church and called neophytes. not just for the neophytes, but for all of us. So what is this then? If he's basing this image, and there's kind of a little bit of what each year will involve. If he's basing this image on the catechumenate, then what the bishop is asking us as a church, as the church in South Carolina, is to enter a process of conversion. And so that what people sometimes ask me is, well, what's the end game? What does he want us to do? And what he wants us to do is by 2029 to be different, to be changed, right? And again, this isn't something other than what everyday Christian life is about. Like, we're always called to all of these things. It's just that each year we're going to give each of these elements some emphasis and put it in the forefront. But they're all a part of the Christian life, and always a part of the Christian life. We didn't just say, we're going to talk about the gospel this past year, but I only have about a week left, or a week and a half left to talk about the gospel, and we're never going to bring it up again, right? And that the reason we start with the gospel is, as I'll show in a second, that grounds everything. That grounds everything else, everything we do. So that's the process. So the process is that we as a church family, as the faithful in South Carolina, will be changed. We'll grow in our faith and in our mission. Now I know I don't want to go too long, but we've visited this past year. We did talk about the good news. One of the words I want to mention there, you've probably heard it a lot. So some of the words here are evangelize, which comes from that Greek word for good news. It's also where we get the Old English Gospel, which is where we get gospel from. So proclaiming the faith involves sharing the good news. And what is the good news? The good news is the message of salvation in Christ. Right? And the fact of the matter is the message of salvation in Christ grounds everything else we do. So we can talk about an initial proclamation, and we use this word kerygma, which means proclamation, and it can mean proclamation as both the act of proclamation, like I'm proclaiming something, but it can also mean the content of the proclamation, right? The message that's being proclaimed, and that message is the message that Christ took on our humanity to save us, right? And suffered and died for us, and rose again. Right? So we can talk about the initial proclamation, that first hearing of the gospel, but also an ongoing proclamation. We all need to constantly hear to hear the gospel over and over again. And I'm not going to read this long quote to you, but I'm going to give you one piece of it. In his apostolic exhortation, Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, Pope Francis had he was talking about catechesis here, but he was talking about the connection between kerygma, the proclamation of the gospel, and catechesis. And he says, in the middle here, he says, on the lips of the catechist, the first proclamation must ring out over and over again. And this, again, is a short version of the kerygma, of the proclamation. Jesus Christ loves you, he gave his life to save you, and now he's living at your side every day to enlighten, strengthen, and free you. That's the gospel. That's the gospel message. And so it can be said in a bunch of different ways. They'll sometimes say, if you go to like a football game, people holding up like John 3:16, God so loved the world that he gave his only son, right? That's the kerygma. That's the basic proclamation of the gospel. Everything else flows from that, right? That's the message of salvation. But what he says to follow that up is important. The first proclamation is called first, not because it exists at the beginning and then can be forgotten or replaced by more important things. It's first because it's first in a qualitative sense, because it's the principal proclamation, the one which we must hear again and again in different ways, the one which we must announce one way or another throughout the process of catechesis. at every level and every moment. So as we move from this emphasis on evangelization to this emphasis on catechesis, we don't forget the gospel. We take it with us. It grounds everything else that we do. In fact, I was doing a thing the other day on the catechism, and kind of just how the catechism is structured, how you kind of go through the catechism. And the thing I noticed, which I knew but didn't really think about it, paragraph 1 of the catechism, the first paragraph of the catechism, is the great one. It is the proclamation of the gospel. And so even the catechism is saying, look, everything flows in this message of salvation in Christ. So I guess the question is, what are we doing when we're talking about catechesis? What are we being asked in this year of understanding the faith? Right? Of course, this theme is catechesis. It begins with Ash Wednesday. Actually, the bishop's going to formally open it that following Sunday at the cathedral. And as I mentioned, evangelization is this ongoing foundation for everything else we do. All these other things in the other years are all rooted in that gospel message of salvation. And they all reflect it in some way or another. We're all called to be catechized. We're all called to grow in our understanding of the faith. But we're also all called to catechize. And I want to share this one image of you. What is the word catechesis? Does anyone know the etymology of the word catechesis? So catechesis, it's our word, by the way. And if you look it up in like a secular dictionary, it'll say oral teaching, right? Teaching by word of mouth. Right, and the actual etymology of the word is it's from Greek, ultimately, kata, which means down or like thoroughly, like completely, because like think from like the top down, and then echos, which sounds like what word in English? Echoes, echo, right? And you'll actually see this a lot in people in catechesis use that image of echoing all the time, because that's the etymology of the word, right? And so it's this image of resonating with the gospel message, right? In some ways, I like that imagery. I think sometimes our connotation of echo is like the faint traces of something before it disappears, right? At least that's my connotation. So I like to think more in terms of like a musical instrument. And do I have any musicians here? Yeah. What do you play?
Violin.
Violin. Okay, perfect example, right? What makes a good violin versus a not good violin?
It vibrates.
Yes, the resonance.
Resonance, yeah.
Resonance, right? And that makes all the difference. Right, and so I play guitar, right,
but also the quality.
Right, the craftsmanship, right, how it's made,
by the beauty.
Yeah, how it's made, everything, the materials, how it's made, but all that affects the resonance, and it's ultimately that's there are other things that like how it plays as well, right, that's also another thing, but at least as the sound goes. Right, it's that resonance, and different, like guitars, they come from factories. Different guitars that come from the same line, made together, might sound completely different, or not completely different, but significantly different. This is a Gibson Hummingbird, and I have one of these because my grandfather-in-law, my wife's grandfather gave it to me before he died, and he said, I went to, I tried hundreds of guitars. Like I went to all these different stores, and just this was the one that sounded the best, right? And what makes the difference is it's how that instrument resounds with the vibrations of the strings. right, and how it projects that forth, right? Think about that. That's what catechesis is. We're resounding with the Word, and the Word's a person, right? The Word is Christ himself. We're resounding with the Word and projecting that back out to the world, right? And that's not just for the professional catechist or the volunteer catechist. That's actually the job of all of us as the faithful. In one way or another, we are projecting the Word that we receive back out into the world, right? And so we're called this year to kind of grow in our faith, but also to be musical instruments, right? To reverberate with and reverberate. The Latin root of that is verbum, like the word, right? Right, and so we're called to all as the faithful resound with the sound of the eternal Word, right? And that shows forth in the witness of our lives, in the things we say, and again, we're all different musical instruments. We're all going to project that in a different way, but but ultimately, what we're doing is sharing the fullness of the faith in various ways through our lives, through our words. Right, so we're all called to encounter the Word, to be catechized, but also to resound with the Word, not redound. But and we can do that too. But to resound with the Word, and that's catechesis. So we're all called to catechize. So what is it? What are we asked to do this year? So think about it this way: discern areas where we need to grow in our understanding of the faith, and do something proactive to facilitate that. Spend some time using the Catechism, the Compendium of the Catechism, or the U.S. Catechism for Adults. Get a Catholic study Bible. Dive into Scripture. Look at the Holy Father's catechesis on the Second Vatican Council. There's a series that the Holy Father just started, and he's talking about the Second Vatican Council. What a great way to kind of come to a deeper understanding of the faith. Check out the major Catholic media organizations, podcasts, short videos, Catholic radio. And check out stuff. There's resources on the diocesan website, on the Via Fidelis page as well. But also think about ways that we can help others to do the same, right? That we can also resound with the Word and to walk with others as they grow in that quest for truth. So I know I'm a little over time now, but I guess I'll kind of leave open some time for comments or questions before you.
Well, Mike, thank you so much for that. I'll start with one question.
Yes.
Or actually, two parts of one question.
Yeah.
So if you are a parent and you want to catechize your kid, what is one book that you would, outside of the Bible, one book that you would encourage parents to use? And if you were a Catholic trying to catechize Christian or Catholic brothers and sisters, what is one book that you would use for that?
Yeah. So there's a lot of great resources out there. I tend to stick with a lot of the meat and potatoes. For me are some of the things that the church has officially released, right? That kind of carry that weight. So I do like the Catechism, believe it or not. But if you want an accessible version of the Catechism, I mentioned it just a second ago. The Compendium of the Catechism of the Catholic Church is this treasure trove that I don't think anyone knows about. So if you like that approach, like the Baltimore Catechism question and answer approach, this is that. With all the stuff that's in the Universal Catechism. The reason nobody knows about it is you can find out in the first few pages, because it was there is a foreword or an introduction that was signed by Cardinal Ratzinger, who later became Benedict XVI, as prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of Faith. And then there's a letter of promulgation from Pope Benedict XVI. So you see what happened as this was being generated was when JP2 died, right? And so it kind of got like this got lost in the shuffle of of kind of a new papacy, because if you remember, we for like me at that point in my life, I was 24 going on 25. John Paul II had been Pope forever. Like I didn't know what it meant to have a different Pope, right? And even those who remember previous popes, that was a long time ago, right? And so this was like the Catholic story was that transition. And so I think what happened, the promulgation of this great accessible thing. It's just there's these questions again. Also starts with the curriculum that are really bite-sized and helpful. If you're looking for something for younger children, and especially teenagers, there's another resource that came out a little bit later called the UCAT. And it also is in that question and answer format, but it's simpler, kind of arranged for teens. I think the other point I would make about that is the biggest thing we talk about, all the catechetical documents in the church talk about parents as the first catechist of their children, and that for parents is scary. And the biggest thing that I think parents can do, just like my parents in my own story, is and the best book is the book of their lives, the witness of their lives, the active faith witness that parents give their children. Even statistically, that's shown to be of any of the other factors, the most determining factor of whether a young person stays in the practice of the faith. The most determining factor is the faith practices of their parents. So that more than anything is the most valuable thing that a parent can give their children. Again, it's not foolproof, right? We live in a fallen world, as I mentioned before. But again, it's the best way to give them a leg up.
We have time for about one question.
Yeah.
I believe that when this started last year, the churches gave out a sheet explaining everything. I think they're going to send out one the week of Ash Wednesday, right? For this next segment.
There'll be
because
stuff.
There's a lot to digest.
Yes, there'll be stuff.
It's simple, but it isn't.
Yeah, exactly. And that's and that's the faith, right? It's simple, but it isn't, right? It's simple, but not simplistic,
yes.
right? There's lots of stuff that will be coming out. We're doing this year a little bit different, maybe because of the nature of catechesis. We have monthly themes that we're inviting parishes to use. And there'll be some bulletin inserts that they'll be monthly bulletin inserts that they'll be passing out. There certainly are things for small groups that we've generated that are like reflections on the bishop's pastoral letter. There's a lot of stuff that we're actually a little trifold thing that we're going to put up that has some basics of the Catholic faith. We'll have your 10 Commandments and stuff, something that people can put on their fridge. There'll be all kinds of things that'll come out. Anne did mention that we do article in the miscellany. Or actually, there's typically several things that refer to Via Fidelis and the miscellany. There's at least one article every month on it, if not more. So that's another great resource. And if you don't get the miscellany, you can also look at the miscellany website.
On that point, I would just add that so the miscellany is going to do a theme a month on catechesis, and we'll also through the Mediatrix app highlight that theme and have the folks involved in the article have a longer form conversation there too. So, Michael, thank you so much for